Gleich kommt das Falterradio. Vorher gibt es noch Werbung. Sie hilft, unsere journalistische Arbeit zu finanzieren.
Na, Lust auf ein Gratis-Tablet? Perfekt, denn das Huawei MediaPad gibt's jetzt zu jeder A1-Internetanmeldung geschenkt. Immer superschnell surfen im größten Glasfasernetz Österreichs. Mit maximaler Stabilität durch ungeteilte Bandbreite. Egal, wie viele Nachbarn gerade online sind. Jetzt mit Gratis-Herstellung. Du kannst alles. A1.
Falterradio, der Podcast mit Raimund Löw.
Sehr herzlich willkommen, meine Damen und Herren, zum Falterradio für Samstag, den 12.10.2019. Der Amerikaner Roger McNamee bezeichnet sich selbst als Technologieoptimist. Von 2006 bis 2009 beriet der Facebook-Gründer Mark Zuckerberg. Doch im Jahr 2016 wandelte sich McNamees Zugang zum sozialen Netzwerk. Nun warnt er vor der Gefahr politischer Einflussnahme durch Algorithmen. Sie würden die menschlichen Emotionen ausnützen, sagt McNamee. Viele Jahre war er Investor im Silicon Valley. McNamee hat ein Buch geschrieben, es trägt den Titel Sucked: Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. Das Buch erscheint im Dezember auch auf Deutsch. Im Gespräch mit Anna Goldenberg in englischer Sprache erklärt McNamee, was ihm Sorgen bereitet und wie sich die Kultur im Silicon Valley gewandelt hat.
By the time this interview will be published, the elections will be over and the political candidates and parties will have spent hundreds and thousands of euros on political ads on Facebook and Instagram. Is that something that's worrying you?
I worry a lot about the use of micro-targeted advertising in politics. The notion that a campaign can be broken up into a separate appeal to each voter, targeted at whatever the weakest issue or the biggest issue of every voter is, that I think is very troubling, because at the end of the day, countries are not about the needs of one person. They're about the needs of an entire society. And in a perfect world, politics should be about bringing people together, creating a basis for shared values and compromise. And one of the challenges created by internet platforms is that they enable people to live in filter bubbles where it appears that everyone agrees with you, where any idea that doesn't fit your preconceived biases is blocked, and where conspiracy theories, things that are simply not true, can become accepted as fact, and where people's entire lives can be altered because of belief in things that are not true. And in my mind, the internet platforms, which in this case I would refer to Google, Facebook, and Microsoft relative to elections, so also including YouTube and Instagram, those platforms have a responsibility not to undermine the politics and the democracy of the countries in which they operate. And over the past 3.5 years, we have seen them fail time and time again. And that, in my mind, is a huge issue, not just in Austria, but everywhere in the world.
But then, so as a political party, you know, it's the 21st century. People don't read that many newspapers. They use social media. So if I want to reach potential voters, Facebook is where I need to spend my advertising money. Like, what other options are there?
We're saying different things. I'm not saying you shouldn't use Facebook, Google, Instagram, YouTube, Microsoft to reach people. I'm saying I do not believe that the interests of democracy are served by micro-targeted advertising that essentially takes disinformation or completely irrelevant things and makes it seem like the center of the election for each individual voter. I would like to see a return to politics of persuasion, where the persuasion is a candidate who comes up and has issues that they stand for, values that they stand for, and has to make a case to voters for those things, rather than identifying a voter's weakest point emotionally and saying, my opponent is going to make that worse, whether it's true or not.
And you write in your book that one of the first times, or perhaps the first time you were worried about Facebook was in 2016, when you first sort of had thought about the Russian interference during the U.S. elections. And I was wondering, can you pinpoint what exact moment it was when you had the revelation?
So it began in January of 2016 during the Democratic primary in the state of New Hampshire. I saw internet memes, images with text, that were hate speech being circulated from Facebook groups notionally associated with the Bernie Sanders campaign. And I was completely taken aback by the content of these messages and the fact that the source of them was a Facebook group that said it was associated with Bernie Sanders. But the thing that really scared me was when all of a sudden more and more of my friends were joining these groups, which indicated to me the possibility that someone was spending money to draw them into the groups, with advertising. And I did not know then what the source of the funding was. I did not know. I even to this day can't prove what the source of the funding is. But that was the first indication I had. And then as the year went on, there were more examples. In March of 2016, a corporation was expelled from Facebook for using the ad tools to gather information about anyone who expressed an interest in the Black Lives Matter civil rights program. And Facebook expelled the corporation. But the damage had already been done to those people. A massive civil rights violation had occurred. And then in June of 2016, that was the first time I really understood that Facebook's advertising tools, the same ones that every legitimate business uses, that politicians use, could be used by bad people to undermine democracy. That the tools provide leverage that is not equivalent across the political spectrum, and that would potentially be extremely harmful for democracy. And that's when I decided to really go out and find allies, and eventually caused me to reach out to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg 9 days before the U.S. election in 2016.
Do you describe a scene where you reached out to Facebook and you had initially wanted to write and publish an op-ed, but then after meeting them, you ended up not publishing the op-ed?
What happened was I was drafting the op-ed when the news came across that the Russians were actively interfering in the U.S. presidential election. And at that point, I knew there was something really wrong. And my wife and I talked about it, and she suggested that I send the draft op-ed to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, who had been, both of them, people that I had advised, that I had mentored, and people I considered to be my friends. So the goal was to warn them that bad actors were taking advantage of the business model and algorithms of Facebook to do harm in civil rights and potentially to undermine democracy. And all this occurred prior to the U.S. election.
But then you sent them the draft, but...
They got right back to me. We did not meet. They sent me emails back within hours. Mm-hmm. And the message was the same for both of them, which is, Roger, we really appreciate you reaching out. We respect your views, but we disagree. We do not think there's something wrong with our business model or our algorithms. We've taken care of all these issues, but we respect you, and we would like to have our colleague, Dan Rose, work with you to see if there's anything we should follow up on. And Dan was a friend of mine, so I was not offended by that. I didn't expect Mark and Sheryl to drop everything. But Dan basically dismissed my concerns because the U.S. law classifies Facebook as a platform, not a media company, which in principle means that they're not responsible for the actions of third parties, which the issues I was describing were all the result of actions of third parties. And I tried to explain to Dan that I thought that when we were talking about civil rights and democracy, that the law was not enough protection, that Facebook was a business that depended on trust, and that it was in the company's interest to make sure that they were not harmed, that the brand of Facebook was not destroyed by bad actors harming Facebook users. Then the U.S. election happened, and I went back to Dan and said, listen, this is a really serious problem. We're talking Brexit, the U.S. election, where there was potentially interference by foreign countries. Then we have a couple of major civil rights violations and some other issues that were going on at the time. I said, it is not crazy to imagine that Facebook users are going to think that this is unacceptable. And if Facebook is somehow tied to the interference, this may be a life-threatening situation. You have to get on top of it. He dismissed it. I persisted for about 3 months. But he never budged. And it was at that point that I was faced with the choice of, would I sit back because I just retired from the investment business? Would I just accept that this was somebody else's problem? Or would I take responsibility for it myself? And I chose to do something about it myself. And as a consequence, I became an activist, something I never would have expected that I would do. I had spent, at that point, basically 34 years as a technology optimist, as someone who'd helped build hundreds of technology businesses, and who'd been an advisor to both Mark and Sheryl in the early days of Facebook. So this was an unexpected thing. Mm-hmm. And one I felt I had a duty, because I had a sense of what was going on, I felt an obligation to share that and raise awareness of the problem.
Yeah, something I also wanted to ask you. You said you were a tech optimist about those, say, early days in Silicon Valley when Facebook was launched, when Zuckerberg came to meet you. Like, what was the atmosphere? Was Facebook in the early days, was that something everyone was really excited about?
So when I met Mark Zuckerberg in 2006, keep in mind, I had already been investing in Silicon Valley for 24 years. So those were only the early days for Facebook. Silicon Valley really got started in 1956. So by then it was 50 years old. And it had always had a culture of products that empowered the people who used them. It was a very idealistic place. The notion of making the world better with technology was an accepted idea and a value that was shared by more or less everybody. But forces converged between 2004 and 2010 to change not only the business opportunity available to startups, but also the culture of Silicon Valley. So when I met Mark, he had just turned 22 years of age. Facebook was 2 years old. It had 9 million members, all of whom were students. It did not even have a news feed yet. And I was asked to help Mark solve a crisis, which I did, and which I describe in the book. He asked me to be an advisor. And so for 3 years after that, I helped him deal with business issues related to Facebook. I found him to be a really exciting person to be around. He was so smart, and he had real intensity and energy about what he was doing. And you have to understand that the architecture of Facebook differed from every prior social media platform because the use of your school email account created authenticated identity. People had to be the person they claimed to be. And Facebook gave the user control of privacy, who could see what. And those were a breakthrough MySpace, Friendster, and America Online had done neither of those things. And I was convinced the day I met Mark, even before I met him, that privacy and authenticated identity were an advantage that would allow Facebook to see where all others had failed. And its success would eventually make it bigger than Google was at that time. So I was really excited about meeting Mark. It made me very happy I was able to help him solve the problem. And for 3 years, I enjoyed a very constructive relationship with him. And it never occurred to me during that time that Facebook would ever do any harm to society. Because keep in mind, the world was changing. Before Facebook was founded, you couldn't possibly have made a global internet platform. The cost would have been prohibitive, and it wouldn't have worked very well. It would have been really hard to solve cultural and language barriers. But all of those constraints, the constraints on processing power, on memory, storage, and bandwidth, they evaporated between 2004, the year Facebook was founded, and about 2010. So you went from not being able to watch a video very effectively at all to being able to watch a full-rate video on a smartphone between 2004 and 2010. And at that point, it was possible to create a global platform with a totally different value system than the one that preceded it. Because when things were constrained, when you didn't have enough engineering resources, you had to work with your customer and pick the thing the customer valued most. And that really tight relationship of the vendor to the customer prevented harm from happening. By the time Facebook got going, they didn't have to worry about what customers thought. They could impose it. And simultaneously, the cost of creating a startup, which had been above $100 million simply to create the cost of the infrastructure that ran the internet application, that cost came down to about $10 million. So it came down by a factor of 10 to 1 because of the emergence of companies that offered that infrastructure as a service. If you think about Amazon Web Services, they are the leader in that business, but the predecessors to Amazon Web Service began offering that right at about the time that companies like Facebook started. And that mattered because if the cost of a startup was $10 million, you didn't need to have lots of experienced people. So suddenly, a 20-year-old entrepreneur like Mark could raise real money. He could hire the students from his dorm room as his employees, which never would have been possible in the world of $100 million startups. People wouldn't have taken a chance on someone so young. And all those things came together with the value system of the folks who financed Facebook and LinkedIn and the other companies of that time, the people who founded PayPal, the payment system. So that group of people, which was led by Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and Reid Hoffman. So, Peter Thiel is Palantir and Trump's advisor. And Elon Musk, of course, is SpaceX and Tesla. And Reid Hoffman was LinkedIn and many other things. And so these three and their colleagues, they brought a very different value system to Silicon Valley. That idealism that had characterized the era that I'd spent my career in was replaced by a view that, hey, the only thing that matters is growth, hyperscale. And the notion of disruption went from being a consequence of an action to being a goal all by itself. And they brought with that a value system that said that entrepreneurs weren't responsible for the harm caused by their disruption, which is incredibly convenient, right? Because it suddenly meant you could go out and just blow things up and nobody would hold you responsible. And what's incredible was that the success of these companies, LinkedIn, Facebook, and all the companies that followed, and frankly Google at the same time, was so huge that that philosophy became accepted wisdom throughout Silicon Valley. It replaced the idealism that came before and eventually caused me to end my career as an investor because my value system didn't allow me to invest in Spotify or Uber or Lyft or Airbnb or Jewel or WeWork, because in each case, their underlying principle violated something that was really important to me. And so I decided to retire, and that happened 1 month before I saw the first problem at Facebook. So those two things, I think, are somehow related.
But you still own Facebook shares?
Not much anymore. So I made a conscious choice when my activism became visible that I would not sell my shares. I didn't want to be accused of criticizing a company and trying to harm its stock price when I no longer owned it. I thought I was on better moral ground to retain my investment so that if the stock went down as a consequence of my actions, that I would share in that decline. I'd benefited on the way up, and I wanted to participate on the way down. But a couple of months ago, I realized I've been at this for a few years. I've done whatever I'm going to do to the stock. And the answer is nothing. So it no longer matters. And I didn't feel that I wanted to own it anymore, so I've largely exited.
And another observation you made about Facebook as a company that I found really interesting was you said it was an advantage that there were a lot of really young people in the company as opposed to previous generations when they were more mixed. And I was thinking about that and wanted to ask you, so what exactly is the advantage of
the way I would
people?
characterize it is, in a world where you only care about one thing, which is growth, in a world which is obsessed with managing to a metric, to some number, whether it's a revenue growth number, a monthly user number, or engagement time, where there is this obsessive focus on a single number for each role in the company. Young people have an advantage from a management point of view. Most of the people working at Facebook in the early days had never had a full-time job anywhere else. They didn't know that there was another way to do things. So when they were told by someone, your job is to increase the user's time on site, or your job is to get more users, they never questioned that. And importantly, when someone wrote a memorandum saying, a man was murdered today on Facebook Live, our mission is so important that we just have to accept the fact that from time to time bad things are going to happen. In fact, someday there'll be a terrorist action on Facebook Live. And we just need to recognize our mission is so important that we have to accept that. And of course, the terrorist act happened in Christchurch, New Zealand. The incredible thing about Facebook is that not one employee at Facebook has protested publicly about Facebook's role in the ethnic cleansing in the Asian country of Myanmar. The United Nations said Facebook is uniquely accountable for having enabled that genocide. And yet not one employee has spoken out. And not one employee has spoken out about the role that Facebook Live played, or that Instagram as a distribution channel played in the terrorism in New Zealand. And no one has complained about the fact that mass murderers in the United States, many of them have been activated and inflamed by what they read on social media platforms like Facebook. No one has, as far as I know, protested against the role that Facebook had in Brexit or the 2016 U.S. election, or the role that WhatsApp had in the Brazilian election or the Indian election, or the attempts to interfere with Facebook and Instagram in the recent EU elections, particularly in Germany, because they don't realize that there might be another way, that isn't, in fact, the only way to run a company, and that Facebook may, in fact, be responsible for really bad things and should be held accountable. If you had a company of people who were much more experienced, there would almost certainly have been a different reaction. The notion that no one would ever say anything about this, I find very unlikely.
you say that Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, that you think they have other plans after
Well, I
Facebook?
think they had them when I reached out to them in the fall of 2016. I think it's likely that they asked themselves, if Roger is so smart, why doesn't he have 2 billion monthly users? Why isn't he a billionaire like we are? You know, they'd had so much positive reinforcement from the press, from users, from Wall Street, the stock market, that I think they had come to believe that they were somehow
invincible.
And I think for both Mark and for Sheryl, I think they had other plans. Mark went out at the beginning of 2017 on what looked like a political tour.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you think that was...
I don't know, but I'm just saying it sure looked like it. And it was an open secret in Silicon Valley that Sheryl had political aspirations. And so I think it's entirely possible, and what I read about in the book is that I think it's entirely possible that their slow reaction to Cambridge Analytica was based, at least in part, on the knowledge that whatever they had been planning after Facebook was jeopardized and possibly lost as an opportunity. Now, I will say this. When Mark Zuckerberg went to Washington in the weeks after the Cambridge Analytica scandal broke, he was visibly uncomfortable doing politics. When he went last week to Washington, D.C., a year and a half later, it was much more successful. I think Mark is learning how to be a politician. And he has a ton of critics in Washington. But he actually found some people who are willing to speak out publicly on his behalf, which, given all the things that have happened, is unbelievable. And a real tribute to the quality of Facebook's public relations. They have found a way to stretch out every piece of criticism, every issue, every challenge, so long they get past the attention of journalists and policymakers. You know, they, at the time of Cambridge Analytica, they promised a thing that was called, what was it called? It was something like Clear History. And it was supposed to be about getting rid of everything they had about your web history. There we are 18 months later, nothing, right? I mean, that's their standard practice, which is solve the political problem right now. Don't worry about the underlying cause. And in fact, almost everything they do is about misdirection and about insincerity. And they're really good at it, which is why policymakers and users need to be aware of that challenge and allow for it. That getting a promise from them doesn't mean much. Remember, they signed a consent decree with the Federal Trade Commission in the United States in 2011 that said they would get prior informed consent from any user before sharing any friend's data. And they would obviously, that would also extend to the friends. They made no effort to do that. They just signed the thing and just kept going as though they hadn't had to do anything at all. And that's what led to Cambridge Analytica. And that was their standard practice. And I sit there and I go, wow, why would they do that? And the answer is because the culture of American business is that there are no rules. You know, we used to have 40 years ago a view that the role of government in capitalism was to set the rules and enforce them fairly for everyone. But beginning in the late 70s, we changed our view and began to deregulate everything. And we stopped enforcing even more things. And the result of that is that we got to a point by the time Facebook came along where the banking industry could destroy the U.S. economy and escape punishment. I mean, it was astounding. And there were hundreds of examples of just egregious business behavior that went unpunished. And in that environment, the message that an executive or a young executive in particular is going to pick up is, hey, wait a minute, smart people should grab what they can because otherwise someone else will grab it, which, by the way, that was true. And so Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft did that very successfully. Google invented an entire new economic model called surveillance capitalism. There's a professor at Harvard named Shoshana Zuboff who wrote a brilliant book on this topic, which for me was a game changer. It really helped me take things that I had hypothesized and gain much more clarity about what was really going on. And Google began that strategy around 2000 or 2001 of converting all human experience into data, using machine learning to convert that data into voodoo dolls that are a digital representation of every human being. And they could use those data voodoo dolls to predict behavior and then influence that behavior. And they would sell those predictions to marketers, which transformed the advertising business. And then they would use their search engine, or in the case of Facebook, newsfeed, they would use the results of that data voodoo doll to influence the search results or the newsfeed to drive people towards the behavioral predictions that they'd sold. That's a great business, but that is not capitalism.
Are all social networks lost, or are there any platforms that are still ethical? If I were an investor, I could invest
clear,
in.
Let's be careful about using the word ethical right now. I mean, the problem that we have here is that we have put business on a pedestal and absolved executives of responsibility for their actions. That's our fault. And the notion of ethics in a world where corporations are driven by a single metric, revenue growth or user count or time on site, there's no room for ethics. Ethics, by definition, is the willingness to subordinate a metric to some higher value. If the highest value is growth, then all that goes out the window. What we're really talking about is whether we, as a society, are willing to stand up for the values we care about in competition with the values they care about. And the reason I came to Europe is because the history of Europe is such that European countries typically value human rights in a way that is more impactful than would be the case in the United States. And I believe that surveillance capitalism, where companies relentlessly spy on people and assemble this data voodoo doll that is a representation of every time you touch the electronic world. So every banking transaction, every credit card transaction, every time you use your mobile phone, so your location and all the messages and all that, all your health stuff, every other app on earth, they track you no matter where you go online. They scan your emails, they scan your documents, they have products like Google Assistant and Alexa that listen to you in your home, in your office, in your bedroom. And they have this incredibly complete picture of you. Now, they say whenever they touch a piece of data, they own it. And I would ask you, is that actually reasonable? Is that consistent with the values of European countries? Is that consistent with the values of Austria? When you go to the doctor, and the doctor examines your body, does your doctor own your body? No. I mean, that would be ridiculous. Now, I would argue that your data voodoo doll is essentially the digital representation of your body. Why should any corporation be allowed to use that? Why should there be any third-party commerce? Why should it ever be allowed for a company that has provided a service in exchange for data to then either transfer or sell that data or use it for another purpose? To me, that doesn't make any sense at all. And so when I am traveling around Europe, I'm hoping that this notion of data as a human right rather than as an asset will resonate with people. Again, I'm an opponent of the Own Your Data coalition. I think if people are allowed to profit from their own data, they can do great harm to others. Remember, if you were in Christchurch, you didn't need to be on Facebook Live or YouTube to be dead. You just need to be in the wrong mosque. Same at the Walmart in El Paso, Texas, or if you're a Rohingya in Myanmar. I mean, in some ways, a really horrible example are the people in the northern counties of the Republic of Ireland, because the Brexit vote, which was influenced by foreign actors, has changed their lives completely, and they didn't even get to vote on it, right? And so it's this notion that our understanding of our relationship to internet platforms, that we give them a little data and they give us a service that we love. That isn't correct. That's not what's really going on. They're taking data wherever they can find it.
And you are developing a model to measure data value, or at least you write that in your book, if I understood correctly.
I want to prohibit the use of data. Okay? What I'm saying is that the model that I'm trying to do is for antitrust purposes. So I don't want to value data so that people can use it. I want to value data so we can regulate these companies. And the key point is that I've worked with the economics department at Yale University, and they have created a theoretical model of surveillance capitalism that shows that our relationship to internet platforms is not that they give us a free service for some data. It's that we have a barter arrangement. We trade our personal data for a service. And in that context, if you want to measure harm, if you want to measure whether the consumer is paying a higher price over time for that service, you want to measure the change in value of the service versus the change in value of the data. And what's really clear, and the data shows this, is that the value of that data has been rising very, very rapidly. And generally speaking, a service once delivered doesn't change in value. And so when I'm doing that, it's not because I want to figure out how much to pay each individual. It's because I want to make the point that these companies are already in violation of U.S. antitrust law relative to their relationship to consumers. And if we can make that case successfully, then their behavior relative to suppliers, like media companies, their behavior towards advertisers, and their behavior towards competitors is really obviously anti-competitive. But it wasn't relevant if consumers weren't harmed. If we can demonstrate that consumers are harmed, then we can proceed with antitrust things today under the current law.
I think we have to wrap it up, but I have one final question. Just wanted to check, is it true that you have still never watched The Social Network?
No, I did finally watch it. I had a chance to meet Aaron Sorkin, and before I did, I watched the movie. And here's what I can tell you. My experience with Mark began just a month or two or three after the end of the timeline of that movie. And, the movie ends, they've gone to California and all. And what I can tell you is I never witnessed myself the Mark that you see in that movie. But what I now know is that Mark was a parallel Mark that was there the whole time. And it's the hacker. It's the person who defies authority. And that Mark is not the Mark I like, but that's the Mark that we have to worry about.
Sie hörten ein Gespräch, das Anna Goldenberg mit dem Facebook-Kritiker McNamee Ende September geführt hat. Ich verabschiede mich sehr herzlich von allen, die uns auf UKW hören, im Freirad Tirol oder auf Radio Agora in Kärnten. Die Auseinandersetzung mit sozialen Netzwerken wie Facebook hat im Falter einen festen Platz. Jede Woche gibt es zu dem Thema neue Recherchen und bahnbrechende Interviews. Wenn Sie auf dem Laufenden bleiben wollen, empfehle ich ein Abonnement des Falter. Ein Falter-Abo kann man auch im Internet bestellen, über die Internetadresse abo.falter.at. Ursula Winterauer hat die Signation gestaltet, Anna Goldenberg, die das Interview mit McNamee geführt hat, betreut die Technik. Am morgigen Sonntag gibt es etwas ganz Spezielles aus der Podcast-Redaktion. Wir übertragen eine Debatte führender Medienleute in Österreich über die politische Situation nach den Nationalratswahlen und über die Lage der Presse. Unter anderem ist ORF-Generaldirektor Alexander Wrabetz dabei, der Chefredakteur der Gratiszeitung Heute Christian Nusser und Falter-Herausgeber Armin Thurnherr. Diese Episode mit Österreichs Medieninsidern sollten Sie sich nicht entgehen lassen. Ich verabschiede mich bis zu genau dieser nächsten Folge.
Sie hörten das Falter-Radio, den Podcast mit Raimund Löw.